Welcome back to the Irenic Protestant podcast, the not bi-weekly show where we strive for the knowledge of God and His Word and His world through the lens of the classical and confessional Protestant tradition. I am one of your hosts. I'm Jonathan McKenzie, and I'm joined today by my good friend Jordan. Hi, Jordan.
Hello.
You should introduce yourself and tell us who you are and stuff.
Well, I'm a student at Greenville Seminary. I'm in my last, well, coming up on my last year.
Do you have a logo
Also,
on your jacket from Greenville?
I think so, right here.
Oh, a little merch, a little
Yeah, yeah,
merch.
yeah.
Okay.
I think I got it for free. But anyway, and I'm also a student at the ministry in the Free Church of Scotland, continuing the congregation also in Greenville, South Carolina. So
The Greenville Presbyterian Church.
yes, that's right.
The only one. The only one.
The only
Right.
one.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Sweet. I'm Jonathan. I currently serve as an instructor in Christian wisdom at a classical school out here in Brevard County, Florida. But pretty soon I'll be moving away up to Georgia, taking a new position up there. I'm very excited about as a youth director. I'm very, very excited about that. It'll be a great time. I'm really excited to get started there. And I'll hopefully be starting an MDiv here in the fall. So we'll see how all those details work out. But I'm very excited. Hopefully at RTS. So yeah, Orlando, of course. Um, Sweet. And this is the show today. We're talking about a topic that's been talked about much, and we decided, wouldn't it be great if we just, the topic's already been beat to dead, like a horse, and we said, what if we just kept on beating it, right? And so we're talking about the descent, the famous, infamous descent clause in the Apostles' Creed. You know it. Jordan loves it. It's the affirmation that a Christ descended into hell. So if you have found yourself walking into any confessional Protestant church, you've likely unless you walked into an RPCNA or FCC, maybe in the service you've said the Apostles' Creed in the service, right? And you've affirmed all these obvious things from Scripture about Christ and His work, and then you finally get to He descended into hell. And there might be an asterisk on the page to give some sort of explanation of what that doctrine is. Um, but this has been a very controversial phrase, even within those who will affirm the sentence about what exactly it means, right? And it's been so controversial that at least in the United States, historically, you had Protestant denominations that just completely dropped it out, right? So if you walked into a Methodist church and they were saying the creed, it's very likely you won't have the dissent clause in the creed. It'll just be absent. Another example is when the Reformed Episcopal Church left the Episcopal Church in the 1870s. They edited the creed out of their prayer book. So they edited this line out of Apostles' Creed in their prayer book. You even have some Southern Presbyterians that end up dropping "He descended into hell" from the creed. And so this has not been a non-contested. It's funny. Usually the Apostles' Creed is seen as like the Catholic, a universal affirmation of Christians. But it has this one zinger in it. So that's what we'll be talking about today, and hopefully through the lens of the godly, the saintly, the very reformed, even maybe a Puritan Archbishop of all Ireland, James Ussher, who Jordan's been diving into. So,
Yes, yes.
Jordan, do you remember when you first encountered uh, the Apostles' Creed in this line?
It was probably, yeah, just growing up, I was at a Baptist church and we said it as well. We recited it. And um, yeah, we read he descended into hell and everybody, you know, up in a stink about it. And but there was also the asterisk. So it was explained what that meant, but even so, it was still contested if we should even use the word hell and what that means and everything you
Yeah,
just mentioned.
absolutely.
But
And then one more note is if you open a modern 20th century version of the Apostles' Creed, you might also find the alternative. Let's look at like the 2019 prayer book, or even the 1979 prayer book. in the Anglican context, it will say he descended to the dead, right? Which is another way of saying this, and part and slightly interpretive as well. So I think a good way to begin is to first consider the history of a little bit of history of the Apostles' Creed, um, and then where this descent clause comes into the Apostles' Creed. Um, so I mean, the Apostles' Creed actually kind of begins as a as like a baptismal creed in the Church of Rome. You kind of see early versions of it by the end of the second century, and kind of end up seeing the form we have today, kind of codified by the fourth. But that version actually didn't have the descent clause in it. So the earliest versions we have of the Apostles' Creed don't have the descent clauses in it. It actually seems to be added in and become very standardized and popular after the sixth century. So it's a later addition to the creed. Um, so they whoever when it was added in, it implies that it wasn't there before and that there's some sort of reason they're adding it in. But even amongst the fathers, they'll have different understandings exactly of how the descent works. It's not like a monolithic view necessarily. You can find several views. I'm not a patristic scholar, so I'm not going to go and start naming names. That's not what I prepared for. But just be aware, there's some diversity, right? But you do find a lot of views that literally think that Christ ascended to the place of the dead in the patristics, but especially in the West, in the medieval church, you have this doctrine develop called the Limbus Patrum, right, which is this idea that when the Old Testament saints died, they did not immediately ascend, their souls ascend and return to God in heaven, but actually they remained in uh, uh, the the upper echelons of hell in a way, right? The where the fathers hung out, Abraham's bosom, right? So they're down in the place of the dead, but there's a question off in a better area of it, and they're waiting for the promise of the Messiah to come in that once Christ came and he died, he actually descended, virtually his soul descended into Abraham's bosom and freed the captives, right? And so you have this idea of the harrowing of hell. Christ goes down to hell, he kicks some demon butt, and he frees the souls of the fathers. You'll see this in icons like Christ in his resurrection, like pulling Adam out of hell, right? So it's this idea that after he descends to basically free the prisoners, and then they all ascend to heaven. But now, after his death and resurrection, we die. We go right to heaven because he's paved the way, right? There's reasons. They have justifications for this. Part of this may partly be due to their view of the atonement as a physical cause or something like that. I'm not gonna try to try to just completely generalize their view on this, but that's one of the justifications, right? Is that the atonement doesn't necessarily work backwards. Um, but when you get to the Reformation period, um, you start seeing a renewed, varied interpretations of what to do with the creed, right? And because for a lot of at least the Reformed, right, as you start getting a better developed covenant theology, and you have a covenant of grace that's one covenant of grace under multiple administrations, you're not going to be saying that the fathers when they died they went to hell, right? That you're gonna affirm that they immediately went up into heaven. But I thought it'd be helpful to kind of frame our conversation to read some reformational statements, varied interpretations of this line. So let's start with the 39 articles. Um, so 13 articles, right? This is the confessional document of the Church of England that they're primarily penned by Cranmer, but he has 42 articles. And when Cranmer actually writes his original 42 articles in 1553, which would have been the confession of the Church of England had not Mary came to the throne and Cranmer and Ridley and all those blessed saints burned alive for the sake of the gospel, this would have been the confession, right? And this actually this confession is one of the few Protestant confessions that kind of explicitly affirms something that sounds a lot like the medieval view. So in the 42 articles, Article 3 of the going down of Christ into hell, it states, "As Christ died and was buried for us, so also is to believe that he went down into hell. The body laid in the sepulchre until the resurrection, but his ghost, departing from him, was with the ghosts of that were in prison or in hell, and it preached the same as the place of St. Peter doth testify. Okay, so there you see a very clear affirmation that Christ's soul went down to hell. Doesn't have a clear releasing of like the fathers, but it seems to kind of be the implied theology behind it, right? But by the time you have the Restoration, the Protestant Church of England, with the rise of Elizabeth, they end up editing the articles down to the 39 articles. And I think it's significant that when they edit it down to the 39, they kind of drop some of that more literal dissent view, right? So the articulation in the codified 39 articles is Article 3 of the going down of Christ into hell, as Christ died for us and was buried, so it also is to believe that he went down into hell. That's it. Okay. So you see, I think there a certain widening of the doctrine of what exactly that means because there's varied views in the Church of England regarding that topic, and partly because you have all these people coming back as exiles from the continent during the reign of Mary. You know, a lot of them hung out in Zurich and Geneva and Heidelberg, right? I mean, some in Strasbourg, right? You have these people hanging out in Europe, and they're being maybe more introduced to other readings of what to do with this. So an example of one of those readings, and probably this reading comes from the Heidelberg Catechism, question 44, and this is the reading that figures like Ursinus are going to take, right? He's the principal author. This is the reading that Calvin explicitly takes in the Institutes. So this is a very popular reading of what to do. Question 44 of the Heidelberg Catechism. It asks, why is there added to the creed, he descended into hell? And its answer is that in my greatest temptation, I am assured in holy comfort myself in this, that my Lord Jesus Christ, by his inexpressible anguish, pains, tears, and hellish agonies, in which he plunged during all his sufferings, but especially on the cross, he has delivered me from the anguish and torments of hell. Right, and this is more fully exegeted in the it's called the Ursinus commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism. It's more of like quasi Ursinus. We don't exactly know how the authorship works for this book. I think people have said it on quasi recently, but he kind of ends up going and defending this view. He says, "Hey, obviously we know Christ says that today you'll be with me in paradise. So obviously he went right into heaven after he died. Um, we know that this whole limbus patrum thing's Roman bunk, basically, so we know it can't be that." Um, and so the best way to interpret this, because in Scripture, hell can mean literally the grave, or it can mean, right, the actual place of torment. And he says, well, the creed wouldn't repeat itself twice. It already said he was buried, so it wouldn't say he was buried, he went into the grave. So therefore, it must be referring to actually this metaphorical use of hell, the pains of hell. And so this view is simply that when the creed says he descended into hell, it simply means that Christ on the cross experienced the hellish torments in his soul and in his body as he suffered under the just punishment for sin. That's the reading. And one of the objections that might be thrown is, well, why would it say he descended to hell after it was already buried if it was referring to his sufferings on the cross? And Ursinus actually answers this objection and says, well, because the suffering of hell included his death and burial. And so the whole suffering um, of the cross and in the burial is all he ascended to hell. And if you read the rest of the catechism, it even sounds like Ursinus affirms that Christ suffered his whole life under the wrath of God. And so you could kind of view Christ's whole life in some sense as a descent into hell. So that'd be that reading. And then there's a different reading put forward by the best council since Nicaea, the Westminster Assembly. Okay. um, this is question 50 of the larger catechism, where it says, wherein consisted Christ's humiliation after his death. And it says, Christ's humiliation after his death consisted in being buried and continuing in the state of the dead under the power of death till the third day, which hath otherwise been expressed in these words, he descended into hell. So here clearly, this isn't referring to Christ's suffering on the cross or sufferings before that. It's actually referring to it's saying the creed puts it in that spot for a reason. It comes after, and it's referring to him being under the power of death. The fact that he's staying dead for 3 days. That's what it means he descended into hell. And so I think it's important at the outset actually to say, I've been to a lot of Presbyterian churches where they have the asterisks on he descended to hell, and they quote the Heidelberg Catechism. Hey, but your own standards actually put forward a different reading of this text, right? That he remained in the state of the dead until the third day. So you actually have to choose, in some sense, if you're going to go with the Heidelberg or the Westminster standards on this point. But I think that's a good lay of the land of kind of the Protestant positions. Um, and I'll add one point of biography before we get into James Ussher, which is that actually, growing up in my dispensational world I was kind of in. The Limbus Postrum view was kind of the view I was taught. I was taught the Old Testament saints didn't go to heaven. They died and went to Abraham's bosom, and they would appeal to the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, these sorts of things, and other texts in the Old Testament. And then only once Christ came and died, were the Old Testament saints actually ascended into heaven. Um, and along with that, there'd be denials that the Old Testament states actually had the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, right? These sorts of things, right? And so this view isn't only alive and well in the patristical churches, right? This is a view that's actually alive and well in dispensational churches, but it's even kind of made maybe Jordan, you can make a comment on this. This kind of Limbus Doctrine view is also kind of a view that's become I don't know about dominant, but also popular again in kind of the Reformed Baptist circles.
Yes, yeah, for sure. I mean, that was the view I took as a Reformed Baptist, was the Limbus Patrum view. And honestly, it probably had more to do with a lack of study, because I didn't really know the other views other than what the view you just articulated from Ursinus and Calvin, which to me seemed, yeah, it seemed a little bit lacking, I guess. I thought there would be more to it. And so I took the Limbus Patrum view. But now, as a Presbyterian, of course, I do not take that view. um, but yeah, well, Jonathan, do you want to, you mentioned we were going to talk about Usher. Did you want to give a brief, um, a little bit into who Usher is and specifically how he relates to the Westminster Assembly?
Yeah, sure. I know it's an expert on this topic, right? But James Ussher, he is born, I think, in the 1580s, and he ends up spending most of his life pre 1640, right, in North Ireland, and he goes in. He's ordained as a priest in the Church of Ireland, right? But the Church of Ireland is really just a proxy church for the Church of England, right? So at this time, the British monarch rules over Ireland as well, right? And so it's a majority Catholic population, but the official established Church of Ireland is the Protestant Church of Ireland. And there, he teaches at Trinity College Dublin. He's a professor there. He helps put together the confessional statement for the Church of Ireland, right, which was the Irish Articles of Religion, which is kind of an updated form of the Therian Articles, but with more specifics and kind of updated more to Reformed Orthodoxy of the 17th century, right? So you get a chapter on the covenant of grace and on the covenant of works. This is like the first Reformed confession that actually like really codifies the covenant of works like explicitly. Um, and at the time it's really important, right? Because prior to what happens in the later the 17th century, one of the really awesome things I think about the kind of landscape of the Protestant churches in the Isles is that they all were, in some sense, separate national churches with their own localized confessions, right? So the Scots had the Scots Confession, the English had the Third Articles of Religion, the Irish had the Irish Articles. And kind of after later on in the century, there's kind of this move to kind of flatten out, right, these distinctions. Anyway, so he ends up getting pretty close with James the First, and he ends up getting himself appointed as Archbishop of all Ireland, right? So he's the head bishop, Archbishop of the Church of Ireland, and a really good friend of King James. And then when Charles the First comes to power, right? When his father dies, and the Laudian regime, the Church of England, kind of gets going. James Ussher kind of he's able to remain friendly, right? He knows how to play politics. But he's not on that team, right? He's just a in some ways pretty vanilla, confessionally reformed figure who happens to hold it to an episcopal polity. But he actually ends up resisting a lot of the Laudian reforms, pushing the Lord's table up against the east wall, and some of these other liturgical moves by the Laudians in Ireland, right? So the Church of Ireland always kind of maintained a more explicitly, I don't want to say low church because it's not the right word, but that they look a lot more like the old the Church of England or James, right? They're very reformed. It's like you're Calvinist probably, right? Pretty exclusively if you're a Church of Ireland clergyman. So because of that, Usher has a lot of influence just in that Jacobean and reading the Carolinian age in England. He writes his Body of Divinity, and he even is initially invited to the Westminster Assembly to be a delegate, right? To be a part of the assembly during the beginning of the Reformation, the Second Reformation, the Church of England, and then into the Civil War. Um, but he is a loyalist, right? He's an archbishop, right? He ends up siding with the king, even though he probably doctrinally was closer to a lot of the people in Parliament, and so because of that, he declines his invitation. Um, uh, but even though he's not there, he has a disproportionate influence on the assembly because they actually end up using a lot of the material in the Irish articles in the actual construction of the Westminster Standards. Um, and his Body of Divinity is just a very popular book being passed around. It's really easy to see its imprint on the actual documents. So he's kind of a shadow delegate, right? In some ways, without even having to show up at the assembly. Um, and then after the Royalists lose the war, a lot of these bishops in the Church of England, it doesn't work out very well for them, right? They're deprived of their livings, and they end up being poor, and you have these stories about these poor beggar bishops now. But everybody likes Usher, right? So he ends up actually hanging out in London for most of the rest of his life, doing pretty fine. Earls giving him money and stuff. And then he kind of just goes and does scholarly things. And then when he dies, Oliver Cromwell's like, "Oh, we got to make sure we put a state funeral on for this guy. We all love Bishop Usher, right?" So you have the Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector, putting on a state funeral for Archbishop James Ussher. So that's kind of this brief bio in relation to the standards. That wasn't too much, but
Yeah, well, there's a biography that I've been perusing. It's not very long. It's only 150 pages, and it's called "The Life and Death of the Most Reverend and Learned Father of Our Church, Dr. James Ussher." And in it, there are a few anecdotes of his learning and education, and it's interesting because one of the reasons so many people liked him is because of how brilliant he was and naturally inclined to certain just to education and reading and other types of things. And he wrote, of course, one of his more famous works is the Annals of the World. It's his chronology where he's obviously young Earth. He says that if I remember correctly, the world was created 4004 BC, October 23rd in the fall.
that's the
And
official position of the FCC, right? Okay.
uh, and uh, and so and it's interesting because the foundational part of that work, or Genesis 1 to Tower of Babel or something like that, he wrote when he was 15 years old. And and it's like, you hear about guys in
Wow.
Oxford and Cambridge and stuff that entered into those schools at 13 or 15, but you don't see that, the core foundation of a large work that was used in that day for a very long time, also being written at 15. And then also another thing about him that maybe gained him a lot of respect outside of things like his piety and stuff, which is mentioned by a lot of guys in different churches, like Rutherford mentions him and other things. But he also, uh, I don't know, it seemed like in the biography, he was convicted of his lack of knowledge of the fathers. And so he took it upon himself to read all of the fathers that he could. and it took him, I think, 18 years to do it. But in this reading of the fathers, you can actually see in a lot of his works how much they influenced him, and also it plays into how he debates with the papists. And so he generally will take the fathers and say, no, they actually don't agree with you guys on this matter. And so, anyway, to that last point, though, with regard to papists and the church fathers and all this with Ussher, we get into what we're going to talk about. And there's a book that he wrote called An Answer to a Jesuit. And there's about 30 pages of biography on what, or a biography of this book and how it came to be and why. But all we have to know is the Jesuit challenged him and the Jesuit lost. Okay. And so in the book, he talks about a bunch of things that will be related to kind of papist Protestant arguments. So stuff on the real presence, on traditions, on the priest's power to forgive sins, on purgatory, prayers of saints, images, merit, and all those types of things. But one of them, of course, is on limbus patrum and Christ's descent into hell. So he treats them all, those both in one chapter, and it's over 100 pages. So what I'm going to give here is kind of a, much narrowed down, brief representation of what he believes. But before I go in there, let me just read a few things from his Body of Divinity, which is kind of his more popular work, which is the work that Jonathan mentioned was passed around, it seems, at the assembly. And so in this work, he on the descent, he asks, what does it mean that our Savior, his soul was separated from his body? He says he was buried and went to Hades, or as we commonly speak, he descended into hell. And this is larger catechism is also going to use the same reference, which is Acts 2:31. So Acts 2:31 also says hell in the translation, at least in the King James, but it's Hades in the Greek. But then the next couple questions, he says, why was it needful that Christ should be buried? And it says, first, to assure us more fully that he was truly dead. Second, that even in the grave, the very fortress of death, he might loose the sorrows and bands of death. And then third, what is meant by his descending into hell? Not that he went into the place of the damned, but that he went absolutely unto the estate of the dead, Romans 10:7 and Ephesians 4:9. And then the last question and answer I'll read, what do you call the estate of the dead? And so this is what he means when he says hell, when he says the estate of the dead. That departing this life, he went in his soul into heaven and was in his body under the very power and dominion of death for a season. So his soul went to heaven, right? That's why, and then he quotes Luke 23, with you in paradise. But he's also dead, right? His body is in the grave. And so that's kind of the basic, one or two few sentence answer to what does Ussher believe? What does our catechism and our standards generally teach? But he's going to get more into it in the Jesuit work. And so if you want to read more into like lexical stuff, why his argumentation for why the word Sheol in Hebrew, which is hell, and why the word Hades in Greek is hell, and why our English word hell kind of just comprehends all of these things. He's going to get onto all of that, and we'll get into it a little bit here, but there's a fuller treatment, of course, in the work. But so Ussher's thesis, if you will, is that the English word hell, as it's used in our English translation of the Creed and throughout the scriptures, does not only mean the place of torment. Okay, so that's generally going to be the objection you hear. Hell means a place of torment. Christ didn't go to hell. Therefore, our creed should not say it. That's what you'll hear, or what you might have thought yourself when reading the creed. But this term, hell, in the King James, and Sheol and Hades and grave and all of these things, hell can comprehend much more, as we've already seen. But sorry, there's motorcycles passing by. But so Ussher starts first with the historicity of this article in the first place. So as Jonathan mentioned, the Apostles' Creed did not originally contain this article, and there's many reasons we believe this. Of course, there's early commentators in that period, should be the 4th century, that did not treat on this article when they were doing commentaries on the creed. So we have Augustine concerning the faith and the creed. And then also he has another work on the creed to the catechumens. He makes no mention of this article, and he expounds the creed 5 different times, and he mentions it none of those times. We have other guys, some names I haven't heard of, but this is where Ussher comes in handy. Petrus Chrysologus, Archbishop of Ravenna, 450 AD. He goes over the creed 6 times and never considers this article. So that indicates that the article wasn't there. We have other guys in 380 to 465 where the creed would have been written, not treating it with a bunch of names. But if someone who does know their fathers well, especially guys like Augustine or Chrysostom, you might actually hear an objection or response. Well, Augustine actually does treat this article, you might hear, and Chrysostom. And so the reason that we have books of Chrysostom and Augustine treating these articles, although we are convinced that this article did not exist in this era, in the original Apostles' Creed, is that first, with Chrysostom, there are 2 Latin translations of his Greek works, and we know neither who translated these works nor when they were translated. And of course, as I just mentioned, Chrysostom wrote in Greek, and so there seems to be some type of addition in the works of Chrysostom, and the same is true of Augustine. 2 out of 6 copies of Augustine's sermons on time, they do include the article, but again, we know neither who wrote this edition of his works or who put it into practice, so we really don't have a good standing for why these are here. I mean, we see in the more confirmed works of Augustine and Chrysostom and these guys that the creed is not there, or that article is not there in the creed. And so there's other stuff in certain Greek versions of the Apostles' Creed. They didn't mention it. Even interesting, Ussher brings this up, Ethelstan's Psalter in English does not have it. So it's the Greek creed written in Saxon characters. And so King Ethelstan didn't even have it in his Psalter and his creed and all of these things. So that's, interesting, I thought. But so generally, historically speaking, we're pretty convinced it did not have it originally. So you ask, well, why then was it added? What was the rationale for this? And Ussher gives a few reasons, some less important, but I'll list them, and then a more primary reason, which I'll get into. Some of the less important one, of course, we've already heard, is the article "He descended into hell" is implied in the other articles, and thus it's a valid addition, is what people would say. So Christ was crucified, dead, or died, and was buried, and so it's implied there, of course, that he is dead. And so if we're understanding hell to simply mean he died and he was in the state of the grave, in the state of the dead, well, when it says he was crucified and died and buried, have already come to that conclusion that he's in what we call hell. But there's other things. Ussher will actually argue it's implied in the article on communion of the saints. I won't get into that. But even guys like Augustine, he'll say this is a quote from him on Psalm 16:10, "Thou shalt not leave my soul in hell." Augustine says, "Who therefore but an infidel will deny that Christ was in hell?" And so, and then Bellarmine, Catholic apologist, he'll say, "All agree that Christ did some manner of way descend into hell, but the whole question is touching the exposition of this article." So he would say it's Bellarmine also agrees it's not in the original, but he says yes, he descended into hell in some sense. So, but what's the primary reason it was added? And Jonathan, just cut me off if we're going too long or whatever. Okay, so what's the primary reason the article "He descended into hell" was added into the Apostles' Creed? Well, there's really one primary reason that Ussher gets into. It's that in sorry, I'm trying to find it on my notes. So in the creeds, the term burial and descent into hell meant the same thing originally. And so when burial is explicitly mentioned, for example, in the Nicene Creed, descent into hell is omitted. But conversely, when descent into hell is mentioned, for example, in the Athanasian Creed, burial is omitted. And so these terms are actually interchangeable with one another. And so the scriptural language often uses burial and descent into hell interchangeably to signify the same theological reality: Christ's death and submission to the grave, or submission to death. Um, and so in Greek, which we'll see in John 19, these two terms, there's two terms in Greek. So you have the word taphe, which refers to burial, and then you have another word, entaphiasmos, which refers to the preparation, the embalming, the funeration, the what we call entering. So his actual being prepared is funeration. And so both of these words are used in John 19, but the creed, when it uses the word in Latin, sepultus, that word in Latin comprises both these words in Greek. And so the one word in Latin means what both taphe, burial, and etaphiasmos mean in Greek. And so in Latin, we have this one term, and the original readers of the creed would understand that this one term referred to both of these things. And so there was no need to add another word and another clause to say he descended into hell, because the word sepultus already meant that. And so there was no need to say it. And so Ussher will say that Augustine's interpretation supports this idea, that these two words, that this one word in Latin meant these two. And I have citations for all this, so maybe we could put it in the description if anyone wants to look. But the conclusion basically is this. The descent clause was not added earlier because burial and descent were seen as overlapping theological concepts. They meant the same thing. And so when one was stated, the other was implied. And so the later inclusion of he descended into hell, it clarified or emphasized the completeness of Christ's death. So we have this word sepultus, again, this one word that meant what both the two Greek words meant. But later in history, this one word stopped really meaning both of these things and only meant one thing. And so sepultus only really meant burial after a certain period of time. So just transmission of language, how people understand words, it just the full meaning of this Latin word was kind of lost. And so upon losing the full meaning, people thought it would be helpful to add this descent clause, he descended into hell, to show the full meaning that was originally just in the word burial. Jonathan, is this making sense? Am I being confusing?
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Because you got to
Yeah.
clarify that, the document. Yeah. Makes
Yeah.
sense. So he wouldn't think there's any already nascent sort of limbus patrum justification for the addition.
Well, sorry, I didn't realize I could have gotten into the limbus patrum. I didn't put it in my notes here.
Okay,
So at the
yeah.
beginning of this article, he does deal with limbus patrum first, and then the rest of the article is on Christ's descent. So they're related, and so he puts them in the same article. But I didn't prepare for limbus patrum. But a lot of what we'll consider in just a moment will
Yeah.
kind of talk about why he wouldn't think that Hades is in reference to this limbus patrum, to Abraham's bosom, or like
Yeah.
this other place.
I'm gonna let you get there. I just think this is interesting because I think the way this is normatively presented, right, is that like, okay, the fathers when they added this, they meant limbus patrum, but we can interpret the words to mean something orthodox, and that's what we're kind of doing with the creed.
Mhm.
But Usher's like, no quarter. It's ours.
Yeah.
This is right. It's not. And I kind of feel like you get some of that sheepishness in some of these other
Yeah.
defenses
Well,
of it.
that's why I think it's helpful to mention that about Usher, that his, a large part of his life, I mean, 10 years or so, or 18 years, I can't remember how long, pretty large part, he dedicated just reading through all of the fathers. And so, yeah, a lot of this, if you just read through this book, The Answer to the Jesuit, not just this chapter, but the whole book, you'll see a lot of these arguments against the papists. He's often just saying, no, you guys are understanding the church fathers all wrong. And he's like, I've actually read through all of them, but it's pretty helpful. So yeah, he's not going to give ground that the church fathers were actually on the side of limbus. I'm sure there are some that he would say are, but he's going to be interpreting a lot of them to not be referring to limbus patrum.
Right.
But so let me continue. So that's kind of the more historical argument, and Greek and Latin and whatever. But when he gets more into the scriptures, and I'm only going to give a few verses just for the sake of time, but he's considering these words, right? The word dead in English, the word infernus in Latin, the word Sheol in Hebrew, and the word Hades in Greek. He's going to say all of these words and all the different significations that these words present are all caught up in the one English word hell. And so when we read hell and we only think the place of torment, Ussher's saying, no, no, no. It's more than that. It's much more than that. And so that's why our confession says commonly called hell. I mean, there's more to the word hell than just the place of torment. And it's fine that, if you want to think that the word hell is primarily the place of torment, that's fine. Just note also that it does mean in the scriptures many other things, usually place of the dead. And so he gets to this English word hell, and it's just interesting. I think I'll just add it. He says the English word hell, it's so some derive it from the Hebrew word Sheol, take off the S, and you have hail, right? Hell. And then some say it comes from the Greek word helos, which signifies a lake. Others think it comes from the English word hole, signifying a hole, and then others from the word hal, as noting the place that haleth or it draws men to it. And so there's a bunch. Some Old Saxon or German hell signifying deep, and other things. But Ussher's view is that the word hell is derived from the English held or held over, and so that is to say, it means hidden or covered. And so in Old English, you could say to hell the head. It's as much as to cover the head, right? And he that covered his house with a tile or a slate is commonly called a hellier. And so, you can see how it works there. But and so he would say that in the original propriety of the word, our hell does exactly answer the Greek Hades. And so in Hades, you have, ton, Hades, tapon, the place unseen, right? The place covered, removed from the sight of men. That's what this word Hades means, and this is what he thinks the English word hell means originally. So it didn't, of course, just refer to place of torment, but it originally, in the English at least, it was in reference to just being covered. And he thinks that Hades is the same. It just means being covered. And so we have the word hell. Of course, I've mentioned a few times. We have this very vulgar in the sense of common. The common reception of the word signifies the place of torment. We think of Luke 16. But Ussher, of course, invoking Aristotle, he says, according to the rule of Aristotle and his topics, we must speak as the vulgar, but think as wise men do. And so we have all the right as theologians and whatnot to use the word hell, the vulgar common word hell. But we need to know, as wise men do, we need to make distinctions. What does this word actually mean? Is it just one thing? Is it a few things? And so in the ecclesiastical use, not just the common popular use, but in the ecclesiastical use of the word, it extended more largely to express the Greek word Hades, the Latin word infernus, and everything else that's contained under these terms. Augustine says the name of hell is variously put in the scriptures and in many meanings, according as the sense of the things which are entreated of doth require. So even Augustine notes this. Other guys such as I don't know these names. I'm trusting they exist because Ussher is quoting them. So, but Master Casaubon, I'm probably pronouncing that right. He says they who think that Hades is probably they who think that Hades is properly the seat of the damned, be no less deceived than they who, when they read Inferos in Latin writers, do interpret it of the same place. And we have places, Psalm 89. Remember how short my time is. Wherefore hast thou made all men in vain? What man is he that liveth and shall not see death? Or death shall he deliver his soul from the hand of hell? And so in the Psalms, we have these parallelisms where in one line a word will be used, and then usually and sometimes in the next line another word will be used to express as a synonym. And so we have the word death in one line and hell in the other, as in this kind of synonymous relationship, so that death and hell mean the same thing. And Ussher will do a few different verses, Isaiah 38, verses 18 and 19, and others. Jonathan, a stopping point. Did you want to say anything? Probably speaking too quickly.
No. I'm keeping up with this. Yeah,
Okay.
this
Okay.
is great. I think
Yes.
yeah, I think this is very helpful. Just the etymology here. Um, this all makes sense to me. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm just interested. I want to hear you keep on going.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
I'm
so
captivated, brother.
yeah. Okay. Good. Well, so um, Usher's going to say now that there are three particular significations, three meanings of this hell. He's going to get a little more specific here. So it's not just the state of the dead, but he's going to even go deeper than that, and it's going to be three different particular ways in which it's referring to the state of the dead. And so he can get a little bit it can become a lot, but let me know if anything is confusing and I'll try to explain it. But so he says first, we are to note that both the Septuagint in the Old Testament and the apostles in the New do use the Greek word Hades and then the Latin infernus for that which in the Hebrew text is named Sheol. So Hades, Sheol mean the same thing. And these are the three significations that he thinks, he argues from the scriptures, the three different meanings of these words, Hades, Sheol, hell, which all mean the same thing. Here are three kind of sub meanings, if you will. First, it's the body separated from the soul. Okay, he's being very specific here. It's the body separated from the soul. Second, it's the soul separated from the body. And third, the whole man indefinitely considered in the state of separation. Okay, so in summary, he says Christ's dead body, though free from corruption, yet did descend into a place of corruption, as other bodies do. Right, so his body is separated. His soul, being separated from his body, departed hence into the other world. Okay, soul separated from the body. As all other men's souls in that case used to do. I don't know why I said used to do. They still do, I guess. But he went unto the dead and remained for a time in the state of death as other men do. So that's just the kind of general body and soul or indefinitely considered in the state of separation. And so going to this first one, body separated from the soul. Christ's dead body, though free from corruption, yet did descend into the place of corruption as other bodies do. And so he says here, hell, Sheol, Hades, whatever, infernus, is used in the scriptures as opposed to the land of the living. And so hell in these passages is a simple reference to the grave. Okay, so hell and grave also mean the same thing. So although in Hebrew, if I'm remembering correctly, we have Sheol, of course, which we just translate to hell. But we have the word kavar, I think, which is grave. And he's saying that these words are also synonymous. So it just shows how a little bit of a lexical study can actually go a long way. And that one meaning, in one sense, can have 5 different words to explain it and have a little bit of different nuance for each word. But nonetheless, let me give you some passages in which we see this distinction or this relation. We see grave and hell as opposed to the land of the living. Okay, so Isaiah 38, verse 10 and 11, I said in the cutting off of my days, I shall go to the gates of the grave, Sheol. I am deprived of the residue of my years. I said, I shall not see the Lord, even the Lord, in the land of the living. I shall behold man no more with the inhabitants of the world. Okay, so we see grave, Sheol. I have Sheol here for grave. It might be Kavar. I can't remember, but the word grave is used here in opposition to the land of the living. And then in Ezekiel 32, verse 27, we have another case of this. They shall not lie with the mighty that are fallen of the uncircumcised, which are gone down to hell. And this is for sure Sheol, hell, with their weapons of war. And they have laid their swords under their heads, but their iniquity shall be upon their bones, though they were the terror of the mighty in the land of the living. So they've gone down to hell. They're no more a terror in the land of the living. And so Ussher is saying that this relation is that of contrast between hell is not the land of the living, which would then be the place of the dead, and then the land of the living. Does that
Yeah,
you follow,
do you
Jake?
think part of like the problem is that people tend to overread into this kind of metaphor of place, right? Because it's like the land of the living as opposed to, the place of the dead. And they almost kind of read into, oh, okay, so since, because instead of looking at this as like the state of being alive and the state of being dead, they like
Mm-hmm.
really, really read into this metaphor of like a place and a gate and these sorts of things.
Yeah,
But it's like there's not a gate for the place of departed souls because they're immaterial things.
right,
You know what I mean?
right.
Like, why would an immaterial soul pass through a material gate? You know what I mean? It kind of seems like um, a non-disciplined reader with bad metaphysics is trying to kind of read into. I'm not saying this about like just like the medieval, sort of
Right, right,
readings of
right,
these
right,
texts, but I think a lot of these like modern texts you get from like I don't know, like Bible Project. Even like I appreciate those guys, or
right.
like the late Heiser, right? Is they really seem to overread into this metaphor uh place. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes. Well, Usher, I have a little bit of it in my notes, but not too much. He'll go to you know, Hebrew Jewish scholars in his day and show that even the first concordances in Hebrew, when they would see the word grave or hell, their definitions would be so short. It would just be, okay, you have the word Sheol, and then the definition would be the grave. And it's like, that's all it meant. And it was very simple and very like straightforward. But yes, I mean, I think, not to get too much into
Yeah.
this as a rabbit trail, but I think this has to do, of course, with, yeah, just, I don't want to get into
Well,
a thing,
so
but
I don't want to get too far into this too, but I think there's also certain sorts of like Second Temple Jewish readings of
oh,
these things.
sure.
We can make an argument that like the Second Temple Jews have a problem of overreading certain parts of the Old Testament, right? Like when you have a
Yeah.
whole
Yeah.
fanfic about uh, angels coming down having sex with women, like
Right.
and
Right.
I just triggered a lot of our audience probably for not being Nephilim pilled anymore. But you know what I mean? Some people want to read the entire New Testament as just like through the lens of
Enoch.
what does Paul call them? Jewish fables.
Oh,
Um,
right. Yes.
right. And tend to overread here. And I wonder if that's a similar sort of problem as this revival of Second Temple Jewish literature, which is some of it's really helpful in our reading the New Testament, but a lot of it does involve fables, right?
Yeah.
That
I think that's one thing maybe commendable about 17th century education with regard to humanism and study of languages and the classics and all of these things, that these guys knew how to read, and they studied reading. And so not only in their target language, of course, they knew Latin and Greek and Hebrew well enough to talk with one another in it, and debate over translational issues in those actual languages, but they also knew English really well. And so, they studied English formally. And so it's just like having both a knowledge of your target language, in this kind of very, very intense, degree, and then also of our own language. It really does withhold you from from going so far to say that, to take metaphors and to take this and to make them realities and literal and all this. But that also, it probably has to do with their education in rhetoric and logic, but which are all things that in most modern schools we don't
yeah.
take anymore.
Well,
So
I think we know the nature of rhetoric and language well. You're able to recognize
right.
when what you're reading is using metaphor or simile or analogy or
Right.
these sorts of things. You're able to easily recognize it rather than overreading text. But is there anything else you wanted to say on Archbishop Usher?
Yeah, let me assume we're running out of time. Let me just quickly finish up. I'm basically done. I just want to read a couple of church
Yeah.
fathers quotes that he gives. So I won't go into all the different. So again, just read his article. It's long, but I have I'll try to put this in the description. so that you guys can access this my outline, because I have page numbers in the article to go to where he starts these sections, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. But so again, there's three meanings, sub meanings, if you will, or deeper meanings of the word hell, dead, whatever. Body separated from the soul, soul separated from the body, and then this indefinite man considered in the state of separation. But let me just give you a couple. Is this all right, Jonathan? I'll give a
Oh,
couple
absolutely.
Greek
We're
fathers.
not, we're not, we're not in a rush. You're fine.
Oh, okay, cool. So Greek fathers, their use of the word Hades, it's interesting, and it's very they're very dogmatic about it in a good way. So we have Chrysostom. He says he descended into hell, that there also he might not want a miracle, lack a miracle. For many bodies of the saints arose with Christ, namely hell, Hades, and Furnace, rendering up the bodies of the saints alive again. And so Ussher here is using these quotes to show that Christ went to the place of the dead, and that's called hell, and he raised up bodies with with him. Now, there are views in whatever that say that Christ went to the place of torment and he brought people back from the place of torment. Obviously, that is absurd. So, what does it mean when he goes to hell and he raises up the bodies? It means he went to the place of the dead, and he raised up by his power, not by actually going to any place in his soul other than heaven. By his power, he raised up people from the dead. And so when Chrysostom says he descended into hell, he rose up people from the dead with him. And then sermons of Thaddeus.
Right. Well, if I
Yeah.
can hop in, I mean, it's obvious. Like nobody thinks, right, that when people are buried, their actual bodies are just down into
Yeah. Yeah.
hell, right? If the bodies are coming out of hell, it means they're coming out of like burial in the dirt on earth,
Right.
right? So it's pretty
Yeah.
obvious that hell there is referring to their graves. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
anyway,
I
I just
think
wanted
that goes
to,
back to maybe
yeah.
what you're saying with them overthinking these words. But another sermons of Thaddeus, as reported by Eusebius, Ussher quotes him. He says he was crucified and descended into Hades or hell, infernus, and brake the rampire never broken before since the beginning, and rose again and raised up with him those dead that had slept from the beginning, and descended alone, but ascended to his Father with a great multitude. So he went to hell, he went to the place of the dead, and by his power he raised them up. Now he quotes a few other guys. Let me pick one. Yeah, fourthly, in the Catechism of Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, he says, I believe that Christ was raised from the dead. For of this I have many witnesses, both out of the divine scriptures and from the witness and operation, even unto this day, of him that rose again. It's interesting. Of him, I say, that descended into Hades or hell alone, but ascended with many, for he did descend unto death, and many bodies of the saints that slept were raised with him. So even here we have Bishop of Jerusalem saying he descended into hell, and then just a few lines later, he descended unto death. And so we see these words are interchangeable for some of the church fathers here.
And brought
But
bodies, brought physical
yeah, he brought
bodies.
physical
Yeah.
bodies, right? Of course, yeah. So, and so that's about. There's much more that could be said,
Mhm.
but yeah, again, it's the word hell is one word that we need to not we need to stop thinking that one word only means one thing or only has
Yeah.
one lexical way of understanding it. Of course, the word hell, as has been seen, as the church fathers attest, as James Ussher attests, as the scriptures seem to attest, hell could signify the place of torment. It could signify the grave, the place of the dead, the soul separated from the body separated from the soul, the whole man just separated, just in the state of death. So it can mean all of these things. And if I can, unless Jonathan, you have a question, I would just like to read one small little thing. It's in Ussher's Body of Divinity on the comfort that we receive from Christ's death and burial.
Give us the practical part, brother.
Okay, so he asks, what comfort have you by Christ's burial and lying under the power of death? And so he says, and there is threefold, okay? One, I am comforted because my sins are fully discharged in his death, and so buried that they shall never come into remembrance. That's one. Two, my comfort is the more because by the virtue of his death and burial, sin shall be killed in me and buried, so that henceforth it shall have no power to reign over me. And third, I need not to fear death, seeing that sin, which is the sting of death, is taken away by the death of Christ, and that now death is made unto me an entrance into life. And so we have this threefold application that he gives: past, present, and future, right? He says, past, our sins, the condemning power of sin has no jurisdiction, has no right over us. And then presently, Christ's death and burial gives us um, it gives us the power to kill sin now. And then also in the future, he says, I need not fear death, right? Because he's taken away the sting of death. And so there's a past, present, and future application for the comforts that Christ's death and burial. And it's very helpful because, we'll have in the church fathers this really kind of mighty language on this. And so they'll say things like Christ, and this is because we understand hell to not only mean the place of torment, but these other things, death. We could say that Christ spoiled hell, right? He harrowed hell. He took away its sting and its power. And there's something like mighty about Christ's kingship there. That the right use of this word actually can be handy for us because it really the word hell has much more in our English language has much more power, I think, than the word death. And
Mhm.
even though they might signify the same thing, there's a certain grit to the word hell, and I think it might be because we're
Right.
scared of the word hell. But but a part of it
Yes.
has to do, I think, with just you know, he spoiled hell. I mean,
Yeah.
when you say that, it should bring like Usher says. I mean, it should bring us a comfort that he
Hmm.
actually did these things, and he's our king, and our catechism says that he's subduing us to himself. And so this is one of the ways his death and burial subdues us to himself. And so, anyway, that's all I have to say.
That's great. Praise God. I think this is great. I think this is I think I'm happy we did this podcast because I think if you go out and look at a lot of, I mentioned the fact that this topic's kind of been beat to death. But I think a lot of modern reformed treatments of this just for some reason like take Calvin as like the default on this, even though
Mhm.
that's not our confessional position, at least for those of us who hold to the Westminster standards, which is now currently everybody on this podcast, right? We all
Right.
coalesced, to the truth.
Very ironic.
Yeah, yeah, we are, yeah. Who knew that Irenicism would get you to the Westminster standards? Well, I did.
Right.
Well, I didn't actually, but we got there. And so I think this is helpful, because I think people need to know what our actual view is. I think Usher obviously summarizes that reading very, very well.
Mhm.
I'd like to end off maybe with a short discussion about whether it's worth keeping, right?
Mhm.
In our creeds, right? Because if we say that actually, right, it was added later, and it wasn't really needed in the first place, right? Because we already have he died. Um, um, is it still useful? Because now it's like it's just something you have to explain every single time. It's like because
Mhm.
every other article in the creed is obviously biblical and not disputed. Um, and so I know you don't say this liturgically, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
um,
We
but
teach on it though.
yeah, you teach on it. Like, what do you think this is something that's worth keeping around and just simply explaining, or do you think maybe it's good to pretend like it's not there?
Well, this is just off the cuff, okay? So
Yeah.
excuse me if I'm wrong. But you know, I'm a Texas Receptus guy. I'm a, I obviously even if you aren't a TR guy, you hold to the providential preservation of God's word, um, and I am convinced by Usher's book, even if I haven't quite articulated it clearly here. If you read it, I think it's pretty convincing that the word Hades and whatever else shall mean hell. But of course, in the English language, should we keep it? And I think I think the majority of the church throughout history has kept this word, and thus it's kind of worth fighting for, even if in the 21st century people that word almost almost definitely comes with some baggage that needs to be explained. I just think yeah, I maybe don't have a good reason. I just think
Yeah.
it's a useful term to maintain because of its reception in the church, and it's been received forever, and except the last
Hmm.
whenever this all started. But
Right.
and so I think it's worth keeping just because of its its reception, its antiquity, and also like I mentioned earlier, I mean, when you do kind of recover this word, I think maybe because it's been so debated, um, I think it actually the use of it brings more comfort than maybe some other words that you could use instead. And so I
Hmm.
think it's a helpful word to use. Obviously, you have to be careful. Maybe don't say it from the pulpit immediately, and if you do, maybe just do a whole sermon on the dissent clause and why whatever.
Right.
But obviously within reason, prudence, all that. But I think overall, I think it should be recovered or received. So
Yeah. Yeah. I totally get that. I think you might be more bullish on it than I am. Um, I think the conservative in me says, hey, I mean, this is the text we've received, at least regarding the creed, and so it's worth preserving that text and the way it's been traditionally translated in English. So just keep it in, and and definitely, I would never say that like, if it's being liturgically used to like change it, because that's just gonna like cause like all sorts of like, what was it wrong in the first place? Well, no, it wasn't wrong. You see what I'm saying? So like, if you're already doing it, keep it. But I guess I'm sympathetic to those who have chosen not to retain it.
yeah,
Like I don't
yeah,
think like their confessional chops or
mhm,
their reformed principles are like violated by that.
yeah. I agree. By the
I think
way,
they're somewhat free, right, to drop it because they say it's already included. And that's like my mediating position would probably be like I think in at least my modern PCA world where I exist, right, the ESV kind of is our standard translation. It's
mhm.
kind of what you operate in mostly.
Yeah,
And so the hell just isn't used in that sort of way in the ESV. So I think something like, the
mhm.
newer versions of the Creed that say something like he descended to the dead might be a
Right.
more helpful way of putting it. But
Mhm.
I'm also neither a minister of word or sacrament, or have any
Right.
office of rule in the church. So I
Yeah.
think this is not the system for me to tell our officers how to do their job.
Mhm.
But I guess I'm just saying I think I when I was like really getting into like reformed, confessional reformed theology and like reformed Catholicism, right? That sort of thing. Like I was very like, oh, if you don't say you send to hell, like you're
Right.
sub-Catholic, bro. And now it's like I don't know. I think I've just kind of I chill down and I get it, And if the
Yeah.
point, I guess this is something that's I think it's important, at least in I guess my more pro forms circles I run in, the purpose of a form of prayer or a form of a profession of faith um is to educate and not to cause scandal. And if
Mhm.
language has moved where it could cause scandal, I can understand. Um um but
Yeah. I
yeah,
think maybe our different contexts also might shape why we
yeah,
answer this way. Because I
yeah.
mean, in my context, we all use the King James. We hear the word hell probably more often,
Hmm.
and in our reading, and so except in our context, we don't read the creed also.
Right.
So I think that might have something to do with
Yeah.
you know yeah, it probably has something to do with this,
Yeah.
but yeah, so um
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this really just does depend on context and
yeah,
I'm by no means I'm not trying to say my position is we need to change the words. I'm just saying I can
right, right,
understand depending on context.
yeah, yeah,
I mean all the reformed churches that I've been a part of have just said descend into hell. And when we get to it, I of course always recite it. I'm not dissenting right
right,
to the doctrine taught and so I fully support it. But I'm sympathetic, and I can see why adapting it might be a good idea. Why it should necessarily be a some
yeah,
sort of sh shibboleth, I guess. Yeah,
right.
but I think that's great. Well, hey, wrapping up. We're about at time, but we have to talk a little bit about what we're reading, if you're cool with that.
Oh
So
yes,
I'll go first real quick to let you gather in your
yes,
mind,
thank you.
nothing crazy. I'll just list one work I've been finishing up. I started a while ago, Baxter's End of Doctrinal Controversies, and I've been finishing it up recently. So recently read his stuff on things like sufficient grace and infant salvation, the state of those
Hmm.
who never heard of Christ. It's been just been an enlightening read. I would say a lot of the Reformed pretty like out of just basically completely dismissed the idea of sufficient grace in any respect, but Baxter kind of has his own reformed version of sufficient grace that I thought was interesting to read and nuanced, that I
Yeah, yeah,
enjoyed. And Baxter on his justification for baptism in the state of infants and salvation is very interesting, and I'm not
yeah.
sure if I'm convinced, but it makes sense. You know what I mean? It makes theological sense, but not necessarily convinced of the position. And so
That
that's
sound,
been
that's
interesting.
something someone says when they're on the line just about to join the other person's side.
No, no, no. I've had a good friend that's been keeping me off the boat, but no,
Okay, okay.
no, no, no. I don't hold to Baxter's view.
No,
I
I'm
just think
just kidding.
if you grant Baxter certain things about the way he thinks that you faith in the habit of faith work. So for
Hmm.
Baxter, he kind of goes back and forth on this, but he kind of takes the position that actually the theological virtues are acquired habits, and but not through nature. He says that God actually works the work of faith in you, and then you acquire the habit of faith. Rather than infusing the habit and then you doing the act of faith. So he
Just,
causes the
just,
act of
just,
love in you. And
just say
and
they're infused habits like everybody else.
I know, I'm aware, but so if you grant that, you kind of have to grant certain things about his doctrine of
Yeah,
that.
sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think it's like, oh, I can see how that works. I don't have like an argument against why it works that way. So
Sure.
it's just the novelty alone is made it a fun read. So
Okay. No,
yeah,
that's good. Yeah.
but always qualify with Baxter,
Yeah.
qualifier.
You have
Okay,
to.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, what have you been reading?
Well, um, I've I've been trying to read more sermons for the sake of my own preaching. And so I've been reading, Scottish sermons, guys like, 19th century revival sermons. It's actually pretty good stuff though. It's man, what I'm totally blanking on his name. Oh, Thomas Chalmers Burns. Revival sermon is pretty good. And he also just has like so many great one-liners that are just like, hmm. So the rhetoric was great. And then also James Ussher sermons. I like to kind of interchange between Scottish and English sermons because they definitely have their own style, and I appreciate the English preaching and the English sermons a lot. So guys like Isaac Barrow, Thomas Adams, who else did I mention? James Ussher, and other kind of like bishops and archbishops. And so
You've been
those,
reading some Jeremy Taylor too, right?
oh, Jeremy Taylor, yes, the Caroline Divines. They're, obviously, I might not agree with some of their theology, but man, their preaching is, it's just, it's like a whole nother level of like perfected rhetoric almost. So I really like it. But anyway, on that, let me just read one last quote from Ussher because I have to because I forgot to read it. He says, "All I say do agree that Christ spoiled, or as they were wont to speak, harrowed hell. Whether you take hell for that which keepeth the soul separated from the body, or that which separateth soul and body, both from the blessed presence of Him who is our true life, the one whereof our Savior hath conquered by bringing in the resurrection of the body, and the other He hath abolished by procuring for us life everlasting." So I just like these quotes.
Well, with that, uh, thank you for tuning in to the Irenic Protestant podcast, the podcast which is not dead in hell, but liveth still, liveth still. We're still pumping out very slowly. If you like, please make sure to like, subscribe, give us a review on iTunes or Spotify, and always feel free to reach out to us via our email or on Twitter. And we'd happy to hear your suggestions and answer your questions
If
with.
you've already emailed us, I know there's an email out there somewhere that we haven't answered. We have seen it. You've been
Yeah, we
seen.
always read it. We may not always answer,
Yeah,
but
we'll
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 we'll,
get to
we'll
it.
read
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Some of the
So
questions are hard to answer. That's why
yeah, yeah, we're not experts. None of
Yeah,
us have a master's degree. So
it's true.
you're about to, but anyway, well, thanks See ya next time. Bye.
Yes, bye.